Now, there aren't many seats left on the Formula One grid for 2019 for us to still talk about, but we've made our way down to the back of the grid and we found one, and it's at Williams. Now, it's funny how suddenly when there aren't any seats left, the slowest car on the grid can become quite appealing to the drivers who haven't found a seat for next year yet. Stuart Codling and Ben Anderson are here to talk to me about maybe what they're going to do. Now, over the last week or so, we've had talk that Esteban Ocon could go there. That's going to require, it seems, sponsorship to come in. Mercedes aren't going to pay for it. Robert Kubica is the team's reserve driver. He's still in the mix. He's trying to find some more money from Poland to bump himself up to a race drive. We've obviously still got Sergey Sirotkin, who's raced for the team this year with significant Russian backing behind him. How do we see this one playing out? Let's start with Ocon, because Williams are saying that if they can choose their driver to partner George Russell based purely on merit, which is going to require finding some money, surely Ocon is the man that you'd pick to put in there. He's got a proven track record, and it's a way perhaps for him to stay sharp as well while he surely waits for a Mercedes drive.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? And the driver will probably say it's always better to race than not. But if you're used to being in the upper end of the midfield with Force India, does going to a car that's ostensibly been the slowest or the second slowest car on the grid all season make for a good step? It's arguably a big step backwards. The Renault deal that fell through for him was arguably the perfect middle ground, because it wasn't a drive with Mercedes, the top team, but it was the team setting itself up to compete with that kind of structure in the future. So with that off the table, there isn't really anywhere else you can go that's a step up from Force India, realistically, in that mould. So is it right for Ocon's career? I don't know. I mean, the other thing we don't know really is how good or bad that Williams car is, because the drivers they have currently are so inexperienced. And they'll say, well, that doesn't affect the aerodynamic problems the team has had. But Ocon might say, well, if I go there and if the team can bring the budget to get him in there, they can finally have a proper reference point of where they're at in terms of the technical output. And Ocon might learn from being in a new environment, a slightly different team to Force India, working with different people, seeing himself up against another driver, and maybe that adds a few more strings to his bow while he waits for the situation at Mercedes to open up.
Is that one of the key points here, Codders, that maybe Williams have learned their lesson from this year, where an inexperienced driver lineup with a difficult car has left them sort of unable to solve the problems, so they're perhaps wary of repeating that mistake next year?
Well, arguably, yes. And something that Ocon could bring is a touch of methodology from other teams that have made a little bit of money go quite a long way. And no knowledge is wasted. So, he could just have some meaningful input. It's certainly in terms of driving strength, he's probably the most credible of the three alternatives they've got. But last year they took the money by hiring Sirotkin instead of Kubica, who I think put together a package. He just wasn't bringing as much budget as Sirotkin was, so they chose Sirotkin. We might just be faced with a similar situation this year. This whole business of having three drivers in the mix could be just Williams telling SMP to go away and sharpen their pencils and come back with a bigger offer.
SMP, of course, being the backers behind Sirotkin at the moment. Before we get to Sirotkin, let's talk about Kubica again. We've seen him in the Williams a few times this year, either in testing or FP1 outings for the team. He doesn't want to hang around all winter like he had to last year to find out what's going on, and he doesn't want to sit on the sidelines again. He's off trying to find more money than he brought forward to the team for this year. Is that a realistic option, and would he be a step forward from what they've had this year, given that he's been out of a race situation in F1 for so long?
I think no. I also think it's quite sad that we're talking about Robert Kubica having to go away, squirrel around and find more money so that he can claw his way into perhaps the worst seat on the grid. Now, this is a driver that was fated as a future world champion and a guy that people like Hamilton and Alonso have said is the best or one of the best they've ever come up against. But I don't think Kubica Mark II is the same driver that we got so enthused about back in the day. And I've not been convinced. Obviously, the team have all the data available. They'll know how good his performances have been in that car, but he hasn't looked convincing from the outside. The fact he's having to bring budget already and find more money to get into the race seat doesn't really send the right signals. The team obviously are more enthused about Ocon, and if they can find the money, they will make that happen. And I think that tells you that Kubica isn't going to be the first choice, and whether he's better than the drivers they currently have, from what we've seen, certainly on experience he is, but is that enough? I'm not really sure.
Yeah. He wants to race though, doesn't he? And it's a shame that he's become this sort of Don Quixote-like figure who's forever on the margins and trying to scrape together the cash for a drive when, you know, there are plenty of other disciplines that would have him at the drop of a hat, wouldn't they? And if he wants to drive, maybe he should go and do that and not be just this person cooling a stool in the corner of the garage hoping that something happens to one of the race drivers. It's really is a shame, even though, as you say, Kubica Mark II isn't quite the driver Kubica Mark I was.
Yeah, I feel like if he was good enough, then Renault would have taken the punt. They didn't. Even Williams would have taken the punt this year, and they didn't. They wanted to give more time, take a bit of money, I guess, to help the team and see how things go. There hasn't been that same buzz about Kubica since he came back. And although it's a great story to see him recover from his injuries and push himself and try to see if he's capable of coming back to Formula One, I just don't think he's quite there. So it's probably time to move on from that.
Yeah, I mean, he hasn't looked out of place when he's driven the car. You know, he's not off the back or anything like that. But I think, as Codder's put it there, kind of hanging around on the sidelines, waiting to get a chance down the back of the grid. That's not a fitting existence for the man that, or for the driver that he once was. So let's move on to a guy who is in the race seat and arguably beat him to that drive for this year. Sergey Sirotkin brought good money this year. You would imagine that if the opportunity is there for him to stay on the grid, his backers would be willing to put forward that cash. Perhaps Williams want a bit more cash, and that's what this whole scenario is about. But how has Sirotkin fared this year up against Lance Stroll, and can a Sirotkin-George Russell lineup really dig Williams out of trouble?
It's difficult to judge Sirotkin's season, I think, because yes, he did a good job to beat Kubica to that drive. He was impressive in that first test in Abu Dhabi at the end of last year. But as you say, he's been up against Lance Stroll, who we know from his rookie season against Felipe Massa, not one of the highest rated drivers on the grid previously. Couldn't qualify very well. Was terrible on Saturdays most of the time. Very good on Sundays, particularly on the first lap, so races well. And Stroll's generally had the measure of Sirotkin in the races, not all of them. Sirotkin's been ahead of him in qualifying, but is Stroll the best reference point for that? So it's kind of been hard for Sirotkin to stand out. We don't really know where he's at, what he's about. Up against Russell, well, that would be a rookie driver again, so Sirotkin would be the guy you'd expect to lead the team. But
he'd be under pressure then, wouldn't he?
He would be under more pressure, and then you would say, well, has he really shown, you know, the sort of ability or the peaks that would suggest he's the guy that Williams should back as the guy to dig them out of trouble? Probably not, and the fact that they want money from him again, or maybe even more money, as you suggested, doesn't seem like it doesn't say to you that this is the guy that's proving he definitely belongs on the grid come what may.
Yeah, he's not set the world on fire, has he?
No.
The peaks haven't been there. He's been, you know, adequate, I think is the best way of describing his performance. He's been fine, but he's not really brought anything that quite a lot of other drivers could also have brought.
This is one of those things you find periodically with teams running rookie or inexperienced drivers. If you've got them in the same team at the same time, they can kind of regress to the same level, and you don't necessarily know where you are overall because you just don't have that reference point. And I imagine that's the rationale behind Williams reassessing everything and trying to go for a driver, if they can, that's got a bit more experience, got a bit more of a proven track record, because they can plug an Ocon into the car and say, okay, this is where our car is. Whereas with Stroll and Sirotkin, I'm not saying they're bad drivers, but I just think with their lack of experience overall between them, you just don't know.
You have two drivers who race better than they qualify, so their skill set doesn't really present enough of a sort of a broad mix of techniques and approaches, does it? You basically have the same driver, almost cloned.
And Kubica, although he has the experience from the past, he's inexperienced in this era of Formula One. He said so himself at the Abu Dhabi test last year, that he's having to learn again almost everything, the tyres particularly, and he doesn't seem to be driving to the same level yet.
Well,
so
he's another driver who, it was the long run stuff that he did with Williams was where he performed best. So he's potentially another driver with a qualifying weakness now. So that would just give them a repeat of the problems they've got now.
And Ocon is the one driver in that group who hasn't got a qualifying weakness. He stepped up his game this year and outshone Sergio Perez, who, of course, in the latter days of Nico Hülkenberg's Force India career was almost level pegging with him in qualifying. So you can benchmark these guys against each other, really, and you would say that Ocon is definitely not weak on a Saturday, and that is what Williams need.